people were fortunate enough to attend the liturgy that day. Those who didn't, it's okay. The government is being more lenient every day on the number of people who can attend church and the liturgical services. I heard that a number around 50 people will now be able to attend. So happy Feast of Ascension. So who misses the church? You know, the beauty of the church, you know, so beautiful. I think on Monday, they'll start allowing around 50 people to attend the liturgy at a time. Just a quick fact. Did you know that Russia chose Orthodoxy based on a few messengers attending a liturgy? So they went, the prince at the time sent them out and he said, go and find me a religion. These people went in the church, and they said, we no longer knew we were on heaven or on earth, in heaven, sorry. So how did Russia become Russian Orthodox? 10 days after the Ascension, the Pentecost comes, so Christ arises, and then the Holy Spirit descends. And the disciples received the Holy Spirit, or the tongues of fire, which they preached to all nations. Saint Andrew is known as the founder of the Greek church. Saint Thomas went to India and is known to be the founder of the Indian Orthodox Church. Saint Mark, as we all know, is the first pope of the Coptic Church. But who founded the Russian Orthodox Church? So there was this guy, Vladimir. His name was Vladimir. He was a pagan prince in Russia. He was pagan, and he conquered most of Russia. He was very successful. And he decided he wanted to study the religions of various nations around him, so he might choose a religion for the country. So he sent envoys out to various nations, and they all came back to report. So the first report was from Islam, from the Muslim nation. So the messengers went and they came back to report to the prince, and this is what they said about Islam. There is no gladness among them, only sorrow and a great stench. And they said other things as well. It's just for the sake of time, I'll skip it. The second report was from the Jewish nation, and they rejected the Jewish nation or the Jewish religion because they were saying that the loss of Jerusalem was evident that they had been abandoned by God. The missionaries, also visited a few Latin Rite and Eastern Rite churches in Germany, but saw no beauty. So these churches were more like Protestant or Catholic churches. The last report was from Constantinople, okay? Where the envoys, they came back and described a majestic divine liturgy. They walked in and they stepped in the church and they said, we no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth, nor such beauty, and we do not know how to tell of it. So, of course, the Vladimir guy was pleased. He was then baptized and established many churches. He's also venerated in many churches. He's known as a saint. And that's how the Russia became majority Russian Orthodox. There's around 70-something% of Russia, mostly Orthodox. And this is just from a few people attending a mass, and they couldn't explain the glory of the mass. And it's good that the churches are opening up soon, with more and more people allowing to attend the masses. So it's an opportunity to start attending again, and glory be to God forevermore. Amen. Any questions? Okay, Nathan, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. So without further ado, we'll get started with the main talk. So as you guys know, we've been having apologetic topics interspersed throughout the year. So today we're re-highlighting that again. And we're looking at the topic, can science and faith coexist? And we're very lucky to have Meena and Mikhael joining us to give us that today. Again, for those who may have just joined, you guys can feel free to have your videos on, just leave your microphone muted. Unless you guys have a question or something like that. But I'll leave it to Meena in terms of how he wants to go about questions, whether he's happy for people to butt in or if he wants to leave all the questions towards the end, that's fine too. With that being said, Meena, whenever you're ready, you can take over.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I'm happy for any kind of interruption, for any questions. It's a tricky topic, I think, for especially people that aren't in the scientific field. So I'll just start my PowerPoint up, hopefully. Sorry, 1 second. I should probably have this a little bit more prepared. All right. Is that correct? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yep.
If you full screen, we'll see it just as you do.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So you don't have to keep it in that window. If you just full screen it like a normal PowerPoint, it'll take up the entirety of your screen and ours, increasing our viewing pleasure.
All right, let me just try that again. I think it's showing you the presenter view rather than this view. Is that full screened?
It's presenter view, but don't worry about it. So if you really want, at the very top, you can switch. It says there is a setting for, I forgot where it is. I'm going to be quiet.
So under display settings, yep. At the top where it says display settings,
Yep.
there should be an option to swap. Yep.
Very good.
Perfect.
Sorry?
That's good. That's good.
That's good. All right. Sorry. Technical difficulties. So, can science and faith coexist? So this strikes me as an odd question to ask because obviously, to some extent at least, there are people that are doing science that are Christians, and there are lots of Christians that are in the scientific field. But that begs the question, why do we feel that we need to ask this? Why is there an uneasiness, I guess, between what we feel is some conflict between science and faith? And so I guess that's evident that the society we're living in is giving us that impression that there is this conflict, that we should be, I don't know, maybe intellectually inferior by having faith and not trusting in science. That scientific progress is kind of now the one that answers the questions and not the Bible. So there is, I guess, that vibe out there, and I think that's maybe why this question, seems to be needed to be asked. So I did want to make this a bit more interactive, but I can see that might be problematic. So I just want to get my Zoom up. So I just want to be able to see if people put their hands up or anything. I have multiple screens, but it's actually, I think, making it more complicated. All right. Right. So yeah, and feel free to just unmute and butt in. That's not a problem at all. So just in case I miss your hand going up. So I'll start us off with some definitions. So theism, that's the belief in the existence of a god or gods, specifically of a creator who intervenes in the universe. So I apologize if I do a lot of reading off my slides, just due to the content. Most of the quotes or definitions, they just speak for themselves, and I'm not going to try and reword them. But yeah, like I said, feel free to interrupt if you want any clarity. Atheism, the disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. Agnosticism is the view that the existence of God, of the divine or the supernatural is unknown or unknowable. Naturalism is the idea or belief that only natural as opposed to supernatural or spiritual laws and forces operate in the world. Deism is a philosophical belief that posits that God exists and is ultimately responsible for the creation of the universe, but does not interfere directly with the created world. And the scientific revolution, a series of events that mark the emergence of modern science during the early modern period. So during the Renaissance in Europe, around the 1500s, that pretty much set the scene for most of the advancements in science that happened over the last few hundred years. Okay. So what is science? So these are, I guess, a couple of definitions. There's probably a lot of ways that you can define it or try and explain what science is. So I think these kind of do the best way to explain what are scientists doing? What's when they're sciencing or doing science? And I guess the key words to take here is that where methodological naturalism is the standard operating procedure of working scientists. So we assume that there are only natural forces and causes causing phenomena that we observe. So when we try and explain any kind of event, we're only trying to explain it in naturalistic terms. That doesn't mean that we have a naturalism worldview. It means that when we're trying to explain phenomena in science, we assume that there is a naturalistic worldview. So there's, I guess, a little bit of a difference there that's important to highlight. And Paul Kurtz defines it as the idea that all hypotheses and events are to be explained and tested by reference to natural causes and events, which is different to scientism. And part of why we have a big conflict now between, or a perceived conflict in some areas of society between science and faith, is this scientism, which was pretty big over the last, say, 100 years or so, but recently it's been shunned because most people realize that it's actually a really bad worldview to have. And that's this notion that science and science alone is the source of knowledge and truth. And you'll hear that even now. There's still it's still quite popular, and people will say, don't believe anything that cannot be proven scientifically, which in itself cannot actually be proven scientifically. So it's a self-refuting point of view to have, and philosophers have pretty much buried scientism as a legitimate way of knowing, or an epistemology. So epistemology is study of knowing, or how do we know things. And so relying on science alone to know things is pretty much well considered now by most intellectuals as a bad idea. So what then is, obviously scientism is one extreme, but what then should be the relationship with science and Christianity? So giving you a little spiel about what science is, hopefully you kind of know what Christianity is. How should they interact, I guess? And there's a few, I guess, philosophies about how this could go. I'm going to show you three of the main ones, and there's obviously a lot of gray area here and a lot of opinions. And I'm not saying that any of these is correct, but I'll show you a few ideas of how people view science and Christianity, and hopefully that'll explain, I guess, a little bit of, I guess, the landscape that's out there with scientists, people of faith, philosophers. It's obviously a question that is on a lot of people's minds, especially in these very secular societies. And as religion becomes more, I'd say, rejected in the Western world, although there's a bit of a return to, I guess, spirituality in a different sense, but there's still, it's a very prevalent topic. So there was this guy, his name was Stephen Jay Gould, and he came up with this idea. He was a philosopher called NOMA, non-overlapping Magisteria. And so this magisterium is kind of defined as where a domain where one form of teaching holds the appropriate tools for meaningful discourse and resolution. So in other words, science has its own tools that's useful for science stuff, and religion has its own tools which is useful for religion stuff, and they don't overlap. They're just totally different spheres that religion doesn't have anything to say about science, science doesn't have anything to say about religion. The National Academy of Sciences kind of falls into this independence view where they say whether God exists or not is a question about which science is neutral. And an interesting quote here from an atheist who kind of concedes that, and this is, I think, a pretty reasonable atheist. I actually read a lot of his stuff, and you find him to not be the stereotypical, very hardline scientist or the new atheism that's around, which is very hostile to religion. He's actually quite honest, I think, in how he says things. And from this quote, you can see that he admits that you can't come to naturalism just purely on scientific evidence, because religion has different tools, and naturalism is a different, coming up with that worldview is almost a religion in a sense, not a scientific question. And we'll see a bit more about this later. The next way to view them is this partially overlapping magisteria. So obviously there's a little bit of dialogue between them. So mainly they don't have a lot to do with each other, but there are things where they have a bit of dialogue. And there's a few philosophers and again, people that will subscribe to this. These two characters are neuroscientists, and while most of the time their science, they treat their field from a point of view of science, they do reach into supernatural, spiritual explanations for studying the mind. And they give an example and say, scientific theories are not intended to describe and explain everything about the world, such as its purpose. And they go on to list other fields where science is not really a useful tool and there needs to be other things. And they extend it not just about science and religion, but there's economics, there's history, there's poetry, there's different fields of study that have their own tools. And there's a little bit of overlap between some of these things, but it's, they say it's a bit foolish to just think that you can, explain the whole world just through science and only know things through science. And the last one, which is completely overlapping magisterium, and this will either result in integration, because you're saying that the science world and the religious world are both, the same thing, the same world, and so they're both going to tell us the same thing. And if they tell us something, if one's different from the other, then you're going to have a conflict because they're talking about the same thing. And so obviously most of the new atheists, like Richard Dawkins, who are very hostile to religion, they fall into this category. And you can see a couple of quotes from him there talking about how, that the presence or absence of a creative superintelligence is unequivocally a scientific question, even if it is not in practice or not yet a decided one. So they see obviously a big conflict between religion and science, where others will see an integration. And I guess on the other extreme would be where you have a lot of the more literal versions of Christianity, especially in the United States, where they'll believe in the 7 days of creation literally, and they'll take a lot of passages from the Bible literally, whereas the apostolic churches like the Catholic and Orthodox may take a more allegorical approach to some of those. Then they'll have that same conflict or integration approach where, if the Bible says, you know, it was made in 7 days, and you have science telling us that it was made in XYZ, then we're going to take religion's word over it, and then there's a conflict, and that's why science doesn't, you know, doesn't integrate with religion or whatever. Am I going too fast?
No.
Yeah. All good? So following so far? It's a bit hard when I can't see everyone. I can't tell if you've all got blank looks on your faces or if you're all happily following. But so I'll just put a small list here of Christians who influenced the development of science. So I'm not going to go through them, just to, you can recognize a few names or a few different fields of science that were, you know, these people were all strong Christians usually. Yeah, was that a question or just a random noise? Random noise, okay. So just to give you an idea, most of these were around the scientific revolution. So I'm sure you recognize a few of these names. They're big names. A lot of them founded, you know, huge discoveries in science. That's the foundation for a lot of the breakthroughs that happened afterwards. And all of these people were strong Christians. So obviously they didn't view a conflict between their science and religion. And in fact, we're going to delve a little bit into this, the scientific revolution. And it's no coincidence that most of these scientists were Christians. And as C.S. Lewis puts it, that men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. And even Richard Dawkins admits that science grew out of a religious tradition. Of course, he goes on then to kind of say why that's irrelevant now, but no one disputes that fact that there was a very strong Christian tradition where science was born out of. And even Isaac Newton, how he viewed his science is quite telling. It is the perfection of God's work, that they're all done with the greatest simplicity as the God of order and not of confusion. And so what's important from this is that science, like we said, scientism is a very bad idea because you've got all these presuppositions that you need to do science. And Kenneth Samples talks about these, that we need to believe in the existence of an objectively real world, the comprehensibility of that world, the reliability of sense perception, the orderliness and uniformity of nature, validity of mathematics and logic. And these are all necessary preconditions of science, and they're rooted in Christian theism's claims of an infinite, eternal, and personal creator who has carefully ordered the universe and provided man with a mind that corresponds to that universe's intelligibility. So actually being a Christian gives you a pretty solid kind of base to work with to do science. And that's why science actually grew out of Christianity. You can see that a lot of these, you know, they might be common sense or obvious assumptions to make, but I mean, we weren't doing science, not like now, modern science, a long time ago. And it took people a long time to kind of just take these things for granted and then build on that. And if you're not a Christian, really, you don't have a good reason to believe those assumptions other than just because we've always believed them. And you know, but there's no real reason to believe these. And we'll go, I think I've got another slide that kind of talks about how this is so important, that, you know, as Christians, we actually have a really legitimate reason to do science because we believe the underlying principles that hold science together actually have a root or a foundation about why we believe them. We don't just take them for granted. And this is a really interesting quote from a historian of science, that the common belief that the actual relations between religion and science over the last few centuries has been marked by deep and enduring hostility is not only historically inaccurate, but actually a caricature so grotesque that what needs to be explained is how it could possibly have achieved any degree of respectability. So nowadays, you know, when you maybe have a talk with an atheist, they might make it seem that science has been, persecuted by people of faith for centuries, and even Galileo was persecuted by his beliefs by the church or something, which was actually false. He wasn't really persecuted by the church because of his beliefs. There was totally different issues going on. So he wasn't actually told, shut down by the church because of his scientific work. There was all kinds of politics between the Queen and stuff. You can read into that, but it's stuff like that where just, over time, it's just been understood that science and religion are hostile, and it's always been like that. Christianity has been trying to, stifle scientific research, and because it's proving Christianity wrong or something like that. But nothing could be further from the truth. Science has been advanced by Christians because of their Christian faith, because they believe, basic, things that we take as common sense, and that allows them to then come up with more scientific theories to build on. So very interesting. When you read into it, it's a bit different, I think, to the vibe that's in society these days. Just a little interesting case study on Antony Flew. So he passed away a few years ago and was a very strong atheist. And just before he died, a few years before he died, he actually became a deist, which, if you remember from our definitions, is someone that believes there is a God, but not one that kind of interferes with us now. So he was certainly not a Christian, and didn't believe in, I guess, some sort of supernatural being that is interested in humans, and the rest of the universe. And the three things that he that turned on him, and it's pretty interesting that such a hardline atheist, I mean, he spent his whole life, his whole career was, advancing atheism and, talking down religion. And he was very famous. He was pretty much, Richard Dawkins level of celebrity. And so the three reasons he kind of gave, and he wrote a book about it, the three themes are very interesting. And I would say that they're more philosophical rather than science questions, but there is a little touch of science. So why does nature obey laws? And this ties back to that, assumptions that we have to do science. Scientists just assume nature obeys laws, but why does it obey laws? That's very strange that, it does. We just take it for granted and say, yeah, of course, nature obeys laws. We know that. We've got all these physics equations that explain everything. But it's a very big philosophical question. Why does it actually obey these laws? And it's a very strong case for a supernatural being that it's been designed that way. The second one, how did conscious life arise from matter? So this is a bit of a scientific one. It's thrown in conscious there to give it a bit more, philosophical or metaphysical depth. But essentially, and I won't go through this today, the abiogenesis theories that we have at the moment, and I think Coulter probably knows a lot more about them than I do, since my biology is pretty weak, and he's a biology teacher, so he can maybe, if there's questions about abiogenesis, I might pass them on to him. But they're so weak right now that most people that go into that field are clueless as to how life arose from matter. They have ridiculous theories right now, the really hardline atheists, that no one takes them seriously. And why is there something rather than nothing? And I've got a little video about this one, which I'll show you guys. I think it's next. So again, this is not a scientific question, it's a philosophical one. Why does something exist at all rather than nothing? But the video I'll show you is a more nuanced scientific version of that. And the reason I'll show you, I've got another video about this one, which is more a philosophical question, but I want to show you that in fact, and I guess I've kind of want to answer my question on where do I sit in terms of faith and science, is there is a bit of dialogue. I think there is a little bit of overlap, because the next video I'm going to show you is kind of like a proof for God using scientific evidence. So I think there is some questions that science can answer, and some questions that religion can answer, but there's some questions that can relate to both. I think it'll be a bit clearer when we watch that video, how you can see that scientific tools can help us answer some religious questions, and religious tools can maybe help us answer some scientific questions in some circumstances. Before I show the video, do we have any questions or comments? No? Okay. Let me know if there's any problems with the audio of the video. So is that all good?
Yeah, all good.
Beautiful.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedmann and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the red shift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, three leading cosmologists, Arvin Bohr, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
There we go. All right. So I hope that made sense. It did go quite fast, that video, but essentially the point is there's a bunch of scientific evidence. We use that evidence to have form an argument with some premises that follow a valid conclusion, which is an argument to defend the existence of God. So I'm not sure how we're going for time. I've got one more video, Andrew, that's about 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yep. And that'll be much the end of my talk. This one is more about the conflict between, or perceived conflict between, science and faith, and hopefully it kind of wraps it all up nicely.
The Center for Philosophy of Religion presents Where the Conflict Really Lies. A popular view, sometimes called naturalism, is the belief that there is no God, and that human beings, like everything else, are material things. Unsurprisingly, theism disagrees and maintains that God exists, is a person, and has both created and acted in the world. On whose side do we find science in this disagreement? Many people believe science firmly supports naturalism and causes a lot of trouble for theism. But Alvin Plantinga has argued that science actually conflicts with naturalism and supports theism. For example, it is sometimes claimed that the theory of evolution disproves the existence of God. Another alleged example is that laws of nature have been discovered that prove God never directly acts in the world. But Plantinga maintains that God's existence is actually consistent with evolutionary theory and all the science that supports it. Perhaps God guides the evolutionary process. God could even do this without violating laws of nature, because scientifically formulated laws of nature only tell us what has to happen in a system in which God and other outside influences are not participating. We get conflict between science and the existence of God only when scientists stop doing pure science and help themselves to some unscientifically supported metaphysical views as well. Science is in genuine conflict with theism in other ways, but Plantinga has argued that either the real conflicts are over issues not essential to theism, like the age of the earth, or else generated by scientific inquiries that consider only a portion of the evidence available to theists. Naturalists and theists disagree about what counts as evidence. A naturalist, for example, will not regard appeals to the authority of Scripture or to direct revelations from God as admissible evidence when doing historical biblical criticism. But the theist who does can reasonably stand her ground and not feel compelled to relinquish her religious views when challenged by objections, which ignore evidence she takes to be relevant. Furthermore, Plantinga argues, science is actually in deep agreement with religious theism, since appealing to God's design, rather than to the unintentional working of the blind forces of nature, can better explain how human beings possess the capacity to succeed so brilliantly in scientific endeavors and gain knowledge of the world. The really bad news, Plantinga argues, is that science is actually in serious and perhaps irreparable conflict with naturalism. So very serious that combining belief in evolutionary theory with naturalism leads to the conclusion that there is almost nothing that we know about ourselves or the world. Why would we be in such a terrible situation? For Plantinga's answer to this surprisingly hard question, click here. To learn more about these ideas, please visit plantingavideos.com.
Okay, so I'll stop here. I hope that made sense for everyone and that it was beneficial. I think those videos kind of wrap it up nicely, and the animations and stuff help visualize some of the concepts. Do you have any questions or comments?
Just one. So one of the counter arguments I've heard to that previous video, not the one that you just played, the one before, is that, well, if we have said that things cannot just spring into being without a cause, and that the second assumption is true, that everything has a beginning of some kind, why can't the universe itself or energy be considered as that God that is constantly expanding and contracting outside of our understanding?
Can you see the Word document I've got up?
No.
No, okay. How about now?
Yeah.
Okay, so is this the argument we're talking about here? So whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. So we're happy with these premises, but I guess there's these kind of extra premises.
Well, that's the thing. So if whatever begins to exist has a cause and the universe began to exist, one of the arguments is, well, what if the universe itself did not have a beginning, but has always been there as a God and is constantly expanding and contracting?
Yeah, so kind of like a oscillating universe where it, there's a big bang, then there's a big crunch, and it goes back to and then comes again. Yeah. So a couple of problems with that model. So one is what's causing it. That there still has to be a cause to set that off. That first oscillation. It can't be infinite in the past. And there is. Look, if I don't want to get too into it, mainly because I'm not going to do well off the top of my head, and secondly, I have heard that counter argument, but
yeah, but then when I say like that initial first cause, then people say, okay, well, what's that initial first cause of God? If God has always existed, then why can't the universe have always existed? Why does there have to be that first oscillation?
Yeah, so it's got to do with. So pretty much we're in agreement with these three, and then we're saying, all right, if the universe has a cause, this premise says, then an uncaused personal creator of the universe exists who without the universe is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, and enormously powerful. So I guess there's a disagreement on that point. They're saying it doesn't necessarily have to be that. So this point being in contention, is explained really well by the, I guess, main proponent of this argument. His name is William Lane Craig. So if you do want to see a bit more detail, and he goes through every detail, every counter argument, and he's pretty much the best Christian apologist at the moment, and he goes on a lot of debates and does this argument. He's quite successful. I've never seen him lose the debate. I've never seen him not be able to have this argument withstand, scrutiny in any forum, pretty much. So it's pretty solid, and he does a great job defending it. So he's got a website called reasonablefaith.com, pretty easy, reasonablefaith.com. And if you just Google this, cosmological argument, you'll see the in detail, I guess, defenses of that. So part of that is having having an infinity in the past is problematic for a whole range of reasons. The law of thermodynamics is another problem, and also that there needs to be a cause, if you know what I mean. Like you're still missing that cause. It can't cause itself. If the cause is itself, then there's no cause and effect. Then if the cause is itself, then it's not really a cause. Do you know what I mean? I'm not doing a good job wording it. Go read it, and William Lane Craig will put it much more eloquently than I will. I hope that is sufficient.
Thank you.
No problem. Do you work at Western Sydney Proteomics? Yes, I do. So I just had a question come through. Yes, I work at Western Sydney University, and I work at a research facility. I'm a research facility manager there. No other questions? Okay. I guess I'll wrap it up. Andrew?
Okay. Thank you so much, Meena. It was really a pleasure to have you and to hear those arguments being so well put. And thank you for those videos and those links.
No worries.
Just again, just a reminder for anyone who might have just joined, there is a World Monastery Youth Day tomorrow. It's starting at 9, I believe.
It should be 9 a.m.
Yeah, 9 a.m. in Sydney. The link, so you need to register. So you need to go to their website and put in your details, and they'll give you a Zoom link to register, to log on, sorry. And I think it runs for 3 or 4 hours or so, and there's quite a few speakers on there. Let's see if I can get it up.
Evangelos is one of them.
Yes, Evangelos. There's, I think, Danielle, Professor Malcolm Chowat from Macquarie University. He'll be talking about the life and time of St. Anthony. And Martina Bisavros, I believe. So there's going to be quite a few speakers. It should be quite jam-packed and compact. I think it only runs for 3 or 4 hours, but there's going to be quite some quite interesting speakers, so it should be good. In saying that, there are going to be some activities after the youth meeting. There's a Kahoot, and then so it'll be a half biblical, half general knowledge Kahoot. And then after that, if you guys want to still join, we can play some games online. Probably a taboo game. So thank you all for joining us. We'll just conclude with prayer.